Course correction. That's the best way I'd describe the new Volkswagen Golf GTi Mark 8.5. Now, what didn't need to be changed was the powertrain, because up front, we still get the same EA888 turbocharged 4-cylinder, which produces 265 PS and 370 Newton meters of torque, which means that this C-segment family hatch can go from 0 to 100 in just 5.9 seconds. Power continues to go to the front wheels via a 7-speed dual-clutch automatic gearbox replete with an XDS front differential to allow for maximum mechanical grip. And as far as I'm concerned, it will be a sad day when the EA888 is finally retired. Now, the Mark 8.5 is a half generation, meaning that this is ultimately a facelift, which is why design-wise it still looks very similar to the Mark 8 that it replaces. However, the devil is in the details, because while we still get a set of full LED headlights replete with IQ matrix adaptive LED headlights, the design of them have been changed ever so slightly. So now, for example, the daytime running light consists of this one line here, as well as a couple of little markers around the main projector. And we also finally get a full-width red beam that goes from one headlight all the way to the other, giving it a solid single-color unibrow. We also get a LED light bar here and an illuminated Volkswagen badge up here in the middle. In fact, that illuminated badge has also necessitated a mild redesign of the bumper, because while we still get a mesh design that stretches from one end all the way to the other to emphasize the width of this car, as well as the checkered pattern here for the LED fog lights, the radar has actually had to be remounted. Where it used to live behind the badge, now it lives further down in its own position down on the bumper. Aside from that, it is still business as usual, which means that we still get a pretty typical Golf bonnet, and we also get this lovely blue hue, which, as far as I'm concerned, while it does look good, isn't quite in keeping with the spirit of the GTi, which I feel should always be done in red. Down the side, there are no changes to report. Rolling stock, for example, continues to be a set of 18-inch Richmond alloy wheels replete with this diamond cut finish on the face, wrapped in Bridgestone Potenza S005 tires, which are again the same rolling stock that we've seen before from the Mark 8 Golf, and so there have been no changes here. The GTi badging remains here on the driver's door, done up in red and chrome, which I think looks particularly good. And as we move further down, you do get a set of side skirts, as well as a little bit of black cladding here, replete with Volkswagen badging here. Now, the use of Volkswagen badging here I think is a little bit strange, because if I were them, I would have put GTi, but I suppose having the badge on the door was enough. This is the fuel filler cap, which is something that you'll be interacting with quite a lot, as I'll explain a little bit later. But overall, the side profile of the Golf GTi remains as faithful to the Golf recipe as it's ever been. You have a very strong C-pillar here, very minimal design language, and just a single shoulder line that stretches from the headlights all the way to the taillights. Again, this is a recipe that we've seen before from the Golf, and there are no changes to report here because none were necessary. That said, however, I do find it a little bit odd that there are only two touch-type sensors for the keyless entry, one on the driver's door and one on the passenger door. Given the fact this car is pushing on ~250,000 ringgit, I would have expected sensors in all four doors. Not that that strictly matters, because the car now comes with a proximity key, which means that the car will lock and unlock as you walk up to it and when you walk away from it, which means that you're not really interacting with those sensors at all. At the back of the GTi, the only real change for the Mark 8.5 are the tail lights, which are now clear lens with a more intricate detail on the inside. In fact, these lights now light up in a little sequence every time you lock and unlock the car, and they now feature slightly more intricate sequential LED turning lights or indicators, which I think, as far as I'm concerned, do look pretty good. As we move further down, we still get a set of twin exhaust pipes, which is always nice to see. And overall, I think that the Mark 8.5 Golf GTi still looks as handsome as it ever has. Now, behind this tailgate, you will find a pretty decent amount of space. Because this car is front-wheel drive, unlike the all-wheel drive Golf R, you get a pretty good amount of room back here, certainly enough for 4 people's worth of luggage. And of course, you can actually lower this boot floor in order to improve verticality, but even if you do, there is still space for an inflatable space-saver spare wheel underneath the boot floor, which, as far as I'm concerned, does just seem a little bit more practical, especially if you do intend to tour in your Grand Touring injection. That's what GTi stands for, by the way. Now, if you want even more space, you can fold the rear seats 60/40 for maximum practicality. And of course, the center portion can actually be opened on its own to reveal something of a ski hatch, which means that you can actually fit longer items within this car while still maintaining enough capacity to carry 4 people. Now, aside from that, I do think that overall the Golf GTi in Mark 8.5, guys, maintains its family car appeal, because this is still ultimately a relatively practical car for small or young families. And overall, I don't think that anything in this package has overall compromised the practicality of this car if you're trying to sell it to your spouse. Now, the interior of the Mark 8.5 is a little bit different from what we've seen from the Mark 8. And again, this is where I think there's been quite a lot of course correction. Because while the Mark 8 introduced this large floating center touchscreen, which also integrates your HVAC controls, one of the terrible decisions that VW made was to not illuminate this navigation bar that lives underneath. This controls not only your volume, as you can see here, but it also controls your climate settings, which means that your temperature, etc. For whatever reason, in the Mark 8, Volkswagen decided this didn't need to be illuminated at night. Now, the other thing that they made a huge mistake on was integrating a bunch of touch controls onto the steering wheel. Now, admitting fault, they have now reinstated the older style steering wheel, which has all the buttons that you need, and they are physical, and they feel lovely because they all feel very tactile. They do exactly what you expect them to do, and now you're no longer second guessing what your finger inputs are doing because you know where your fingers are, you know what buttons you're touching. This is fabulous. The other thing that's also pretty good in this car is ergonomics, because this driver's seat, for example, is not only electrically adjustable, replete with base angle adjustment as well as lumbar support, but you also get a huge amount of range in adjustment for the steering wheel, which means that you can get nice and comfy into your ideal driving position, which is exactly what you need for a vehicle that is built toward driver engagement. However, this is where things start to go wrong, because yes, while the ergonomics are all very good, the fact that everything is integrated into the screen does mean that if you need to change any settings on this car, it's all there. Which means that, for example, your parking assist, that's in there. Your overall driver assist features, that's also in here, if I can get that to display. Here, that also lives here, thankfully only one button press away. The same thing goes for the climate controls. If you want to do anything other than adjust the temperature, everything else lives within this screen, and even your drive mode selection also lives within this screen, which I just find to be a little bit infuriating because, again, this is a car that is built for drivers, which means that being able to adjust settings on the fly is something that you want to be able to do. Now, moving further down here, you have your start-stop button, which pulses when you want to start the car, as well as your little stubby gear selector, although we're quite used to that now. We also get a digital instrument cluster here, which is quite customizable in terms of the information that it displays, as well as how it displays it, which I think a lot of consumers really do quite like. But now, supporting the digital instrument cluster is a full-color heads-up display, which also integrates the ability to show you your directions, even when you're using Apple CarPlay or Android Auto. Speaking of which, both of those screen mirroring apps are available on this car wirelessly, which means that as soon as you get in the car, your phone connects up to it and it displays very, very well indeed. And as you can see, it is relatively responsive. Even though this is currently on a wireless setting, my phone is just charging by the USB-C ports, everything here just refreshes very nicely. Speaking of which, there are a couple of cup holders here, as well as a 12-volt socket, 2 USB-C ports up front, as well as a wireless charging pad that lives underneath this cover in order to hold your phone in place. You have decently sized door bins, big enough for a 1.5 liter size bottle, and they are lined in felt, which I do appreciate hugely. You also get a very small center glove box here, but at least you do get an adjustable armrest, which means that you can get this up to exactly the right position and then extend it, so it's actually useful for your arm. I always appreciate this in Volkswagen, at least in this one. It still feels pretty solid. We also have a decently sized glove box here, which opens with a nice damped effect, but unfortunately this is lined in hard plastic, which means that once again, anything that you put in there will most likely rattle about. The other thing about this car that I don't find particularly impressive is the overall material quality, because while the dash top here is very squidgy, and you also get soft touch materials up here on the doors, the moment you move further down from sort of where your shoulder line is, you already start to encounter hard, scratchy plastics. The same goes for this particular panel here, where you have all of your controls for the windows, and even moving further down on the door, this is all hard, scratchy plastic. Of course, there is some soft touch material sort of where your elbow is, both on the door card as well as on the armrest itself, but this is over 200 grand. Come on. This center console, for example, is just covered in piano black. And because this car has done about 13,000 kilometers, it's all scratched up, which means that if this was your car, this would be even more irritating. The center console is also done up in hard plastic, which is not great. The most offensive part, however, are, to me at least, the seats, because while this driver's seat is very nice and both front seats are both heated and ventilated, and of course they provide good lateral support and the headrests are nicely integrated for a single piece design, the passenger seat is manual. In a 200,000 ringgit car, I don't care that this is a performance hatchback, I could not care less. The simple fact of the matter is, this is over 200,000 ringgit and there is a ratchet to move the front passenger seat. Now, aside from that, at least Volkswagen does chuck in a Harman Kardon audio system, which is nice. Now, in the back of the Golf GTi, life is actually pretty good. Now, I'm about 170 centimeters. I have a good amount of headroom and a pretty decent amount of knee room sat behind myself, which is all pretty good. And packaging back here is also pretty good because the floor, or the footwells rather, are quite deep, which means I have a pretty good amount of under-thigh support and I can tuck my feet in underneath the seat in front of me. So even though this is a relatively compact car, I am quite comfortable back here. This is also aided by the fact that I have my own climate control zone, although unfortunately the air only comes out from a set of crotch coolers. And I do get a couple of USB-C ports, which means that overall life back here is not bad. In terms of practicality, I have two small pockets on the tops of the front seats, as well as a larger pocket that lives beneath. I have door bins big enough for a litre-sized bottle. I've also got a deployable center armrest here with a couple of cup holders, as well as that ski hatch that I mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, however, if you are trying to fit 3 people abreast back here, there is a very sizable center tunnel. And because the center console actually extends quite a way back here, it does mean that in terms of knee room, that's not going to be all too great. And there will be some fighting for foot space on either side of that tunnel. But for 4 passengers, it's not that bad. Now, if you're looking at this as a family car, you'll appreciate the fact the ISOFIX mounts are very, very easy to locate in this car. And there are plastic covers over the ISOFIX mounts that do not sort of take off. They sort of stay there, they're hinged, which means that you're not going to lose them over time, unlike what we've seen before from some other car makers. I can't remember which ones. But overall, life back here in terms of space is pretty good. However, in terms of quality, not great. Once again, let me remind you, this is a car that is north of 200,000 ringgit, and yet here I find hard plastic, unlike what I found in the front. The same goes here. This is also hard plastic, but at least here where my arm is, that's soft, although again, the hard plastic continues around the window controls as well as further down here on the door, which means that life is not so great if you're the type of person who looks at stuff like this as a measure of how much money you've spent. This is just not great. What I find even more offensive is the fact that while on the front you get this sort of pseudo metallic carbon fibery finish on the dash front as well as on the doors, you get none of that back here. So even though you do have ambient lighting available here on the door, it just spills out onto this hard, scratchy black plastic panel, which is just not great. Again, this is over 200,000 ringgit. I would have expected at least soft touch materials back here. I mean, come on. But the thing is, an argument can be made for the Golf GTi that the majority of your money when you buy a car like this is spent on the mechanicals. And to be fair, the Mk8.5 doesn't disappoint on paper because now we have more power and more torque than ever before. And Volkswagen has even promised that they have fiddled with the way this car drives just a little bit in order to reinvigorate and reignite the spark and the flame that's existed for the Golf GTi. However, the criticisms that I leveled at the Mk8 Golf GTi was that it all felt a little bit antiseptic. It felt almost like they had sanitized the overall experience of the GTi in order to broaden its appeal to the point where it ended up feeling like it was alienating the genuine enthusiasts that used to love and swear by these cars. Now, for the Mk8.5, I'm glad that Volkswagen has demonstrated they are willing to listen to reason. So, for example, the 8.5 now has physical controls everywhere, which is nice. The temperature controls now have backlighting, which is also very nice. But the driving experience, to me, I think, is where Volkswagen has spent some time in order to try and make this experience a little bit more in line with what enthusiasts expect from a vehicle like this. So for example, the vario-rack steering on this, or the variable ratio steering that you've gotten on the Golf since the Mark 7 is now retuned, so now it's a little bit heavier. It feels just as accurate as it's ever been, and it's trying desperately to provide a little bit more information through the wheel compared to how it used to be, completely numb, as it was in the Mark 8. And I think that that has worked somewhat in order to make this feel a little bit more driver focused. Now, the thing about the steering is that while there's still not as much information coming through this wheel as there used to be from, again, the Mark 7 or Mark 7.5, it now at least feels a little bit more accurate, feels a little bit more engaging and involving compared to what it used to be. So that certainly bodes well for what is ultimately meant to be a driver-focused machine after all. And then they've paid attention to some smaller things in order to help improve the experience of being in the car and driving a Golf GTi, one of which actually comes in the form of sound. So the outgoing Mark 8 I accused of being too quiet, too refined. It felt so much like it was trying to be a luxury car that it forgot that one of its primary objectives was to be fun. This is ultimately meant to be a hot hatch, and a hot hatch isn't meant to be the most refined thing on the planet. Instead, it's meant to provide, again, some degree of driver engagement and driver involvement in order to sort of appeal to enthusiasts. And so for this Mark 8.5, they've now introduced more sound into the cabin, synthesized of course, but still more noise. And you can actually adjust the noise on the outside. So via the individual mode in this car, not only can you adjust this car's dynamic chassis control, which provides a huge breadth of ability between making this car feel very comfortable or indeed making this car feel very, 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 very stiff, but you can now also adjust the noise. So for example, in my individual mode that I'm driving on now, we now have more noise on the outside as well as on the inside, which again helps to feed the slightly more enthusiast-driven experience in the Mark 8.5. And it also means that even though my engine mapping or engine mode might be set to eco, I still enjoy the noise, which is nice. This is the sort of thing that you want from a car that's supposed to be able to do daily duty as well as be a weekend fun car in equal measure. And so the ability to have a little bit more of that rorty noise and rorty sound effects while I'm doing the daily grind is nice. And it's such a nice noise. Even though it is predominantly fake, there is some noise that comes from the outside. I actually checked this. And it does sound pretty good. It even does some pops and bangs on startup, and if you rev it a little bit, which is nice. That is, again, exactly what customers expect from a Golf GTi, and so the Golf GTi Mark 8.5 seems to deliver that in spades. What the 8.5 also seems to do quite well, as I come to a stoplight, is manage its weight and its body quite well. Now, the Mark 8.5 is hardly the lightest Golf GTi in existence, nor is it the lightest Golf GTi in modern history. But thankfully, because of the dynamic chassis control, and again, its very, very wide breadth of ability, it means that this car really does feel completely dialed in when you want it to be. When you are attacking a B road, you stick this car into sport mode, the suspension completely stiffens up, and it really feels like you're driving a go-kart. Now, the brakes on this car feel fabulous thanks to the huge brake kit that you get on this car as standard. It feels very natural, very progressive, and it's very hard to overheat, as I discovered. And although, again, the steering is relatively bereft of any sort of feel or information, because it is at least accurate, it does mean that, again, when you go into a mood, when the red mist descends and you want to attack a B road, the Golf GTi 8.5 does seem to know how to keep up and provide an interesting enough driving experience for you to feel like you're enjoying yourself, that you're capable of enjoying yourself. That is all really good. And once you're gone, once that red mist disappears and dissipates and it's time for you to just cruise back home again, you can set the DCC on its softest setting and leave the car in individual mode so you still get all the noise and you just cruise comfortably all the way home. Now, talking about ride specifically, because of the dynamic chassis control, it really does mean that this car can do a little bit of everything. When you're driving about in town, you can set the DCC to comfort, and then it just gets over potholes without too much fuss. Of course, because this car rides on 18-inch alloy wheels, some degree of rattle is going to get into the cabin, but the car does a pretty good job of smoothing out the very worst of it, which means that within the cabin it always feels very civilized. And then of course, when you are on the motorway, again, it just helps to sort of smoothen out the worst undulations in the road. And at no point does the Golf GTi 8.5 feel unsettled. This feels like a car that can really do a little bit of everything. That is especially true when you consider the fact that the Mk 8.5 comes with IQ Drive as standard, which is something that was only introduced in the pre-facelift model. Now, as a result, that also means that when you are stuck in traffic doing the daily grind, the Golf GTi is now more livable than ever before, and for whatever reason, it also feels like the 7-speed dual-clutch automatic has been polished even further, specifically to improve low-speed drivability. So now you don't get the same lurchiness and eagerness that you used to get from vehicles with a turbocharged engine and a dual-clutch gearbox. Instead, this feels a lot smoother and a lot more predictable. And when you add IQ Drive into it, it just means that getting stuck in traffic doesn't feel like a laborious process anymore because the car can do the majority of the work for you. This also helps improve motorway driving because the lane centering assist on this car also feels very, very natural and therefore very reliable. And so this really does feel like a car that can do a little bit of everything. However, there are 2 points I'd like to bring up that do sort of sully the experience a little bit. Firstly is fuel consumption. Now, the Golf GTi Mk8, although I did give it a lot of grief, was at least very good at being very efficient because that car, via daily grinds and motorway runs, your typical sort of testing schedule that we subject cars to, the Mk8 would return about 7.5 to 8 liters to the 100, which is very respectable for something that is able to offer north of 200 PS. However, for whatever reason, in this 8.5, I haven't been able to get that number below 10 liters to the 100. Now, I'm not entirely sure why. I've checked the tire pressures, I've checked every possible permutation in this car that might have something to do with that terrible fuel economy, but I can't seem to find any reasonable excuse for this car consuming quite so much fuel. Maybe it's just been more fun to drive, although I don't think that's quite been it. But the most irritating part to me is the refinement or lack thereof, because once again, need I remind you, this is a car that costs north of 200,000 ringgit. And given the fact that the T in GTi stands for touring, you'd imagine that this car would be a little bit better at doing just that, particularly at speeds over about 100-110 kilometers an hour when you're just trying to cover a significant amount of distance, perhaps with the family in tow. Unfortunately, the Golf GTi does seem to suffer from quite a bit of road noise and quite a bit of wind noise. In fact, once you hit about 115-120 kilometers an hour indicated on the speedo, at that point, the amount of noise that enters the cabin is quite disruptive. And to be honest, after a couple of hours, it does get a little bit tiring. And to me, I think that really does take away from the overall polish of the GTi. Although I do understand that at this point, you're probably wondering what my problem is exactly, because on the one hand, I want this car to be less polished. On the other hand, I'm now also giving it grief for not being polished enough. The simple fact of the matter is we have seen cars within this space that are able to do a bit of both, or they focus on one specific thing. So for example, the outgoing Renault Megane RS, which we had in our market for a brief amount of time, and now you can't seem to buy them anymore, that car was so focused on the driving experience that you were willing to compromise in certain areas there and thereabouts in order to enjoy that very hemmed in, very involved, very engaging driving experience. You understood that getting into a Megane RS meant that you were making compromises in terms of practicality and daily usability in order to enjoy what I felt at the time to be a truly uncompromised driver-focused experience. On the other hand, we also have vehicles like the Toyota Corolla GR Corolla rather, where without any of the electronic trickery that this car comes with, again, seems to provide a better balance of that sort of Jekyll and Hyde nature. Whereas in this, it just feels like it's focused too much on both that it's ended up landing not quite in the middle. To me, the Golf GTi still doesn't feel as involving as I'd want a Golf GTi to be. It just seems to fall short of the mark. And yet, despite not being that much of a driver's car anymore, it's also not that great at being a posh upmarket luxury car either. Which means that if you are in this space looking for a more luxurious experience, you are most likely going to end up in the showroom of a Mercedes-Benz dealership, which is where I think the majority of these customers have ended up. And then, of course, if you want something that is more driver-focused, you'll have to spend a little bit more money, but you could end up in a Toyota GR Corolla, which is also available as a manual, which just means that, again, in terms of driver-focused, driver engagement, Now we've got that, and then in terms of luxury cars, you have the Mercedes AMG, which means that the Golf GTi sits in this uncomfortable sort of barren landscape between the two, in this valley, where it just feels like beyond the badge and the appeal of a Golf GTi, there really doesn't seem to be much in it anymore. As far as I'm concerned, if I was looking for a driver-focused hot hatch, this isn't where I'd spend my money. Make no mistake, the Golf GTi is as accomplished now as a Mk8.5 as it has ever been. It has a wider breadth of ability than ever before. It's got more electronic gizmos in order to keep you amused and safe on the road. And overall, there is no doubt that this is the best overall package that there's ever been. But the thing is, as an overall package, that's always been the appeal of the Golf. The GTi has always been, meant to be at least, a driver's car. So why am I just not getting that fizz? I just feel a little bit disconnected from the experiences and from the sensations that I want out of this car. Which means that, unfortunately, despite the raft of updates to this car, many of which I think are certainly good on them, things like returning the buttons to the steering wheel, I know many people will be very happy with that, myself included. The driving experience of this, as a driving enthusiast, still leaves just a little bit to be desired. I think that they've gotten very close to bringing the mojo back to the Golf GTi, but perhaps they just need one more generation to figure this out. Maybe. In any case, that concludes our review of the 2026 Volkswagen Golf GTi Mk8.5. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All the links are in the description below, including the link to join our new WhatsApp channel. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.